Why don't we start with a prolonged introduction. Jared is en route between the BART station and here. The bridge was down, the San Rafael Bridge was down, and so he's come through a multimodal, multi-city route to us. But let me just say a few words, or maybe many words about his background while you're waiting. 3 years ago, Jared was elected to be assemblyman for the 6th Assembly District, which is Marin County and the southern part of Sonoma County. Prior to that, he'd worked at NRDC, and he'd been the one of the main litigators in
the program manager.
He was the manager of the program to restore flows to the San Joaquin River. Peter Vorster worked on that project. I worked on that project with NRDC. And it culminated in an agreement actually shortly before the election in 2006, a settlement. The Friant unit, the Friant Dam of the Central Valley Project, which started delivering water in 1949, cut off most of the flow of the San Joaquin River and left a stretch of the river, what, about 40 miles is it?
Or 65 miles that was dry, and other parts that were using delta water to convey.
Right. But it dried off the sort of middle reach of the San Joaquin River, which made that impassable and impossible for salmon who had spawned in the upper reaches of the river. That was upheld by, when the project started in 1949, there were lawsuits by fisheries groups, by the State Fish and Game to block the operation of the project because it destroyed a salmon run. And those lawsuits lost, and the diversions to the Friant unit were upheld. In 1988, 39 years later, NRDC began a lawsuit to block the renewal of Bureau contracts after 40 years had expired. That was 1988, and it culminated in a successful settlement in 2006. As I say, Jared managed that program for NRDC. NRDC was the lead plaintiff, but one of a number of plaintiffs. Before starting at the other end, Jared was an undergraduate at UC Santa Barbara and played on the volleyball team and was a star volleyball player. And then went to Boston College to get his law degree and was a litigator in private practice for a number of years, a very successful litigator, litigating civil rights issues and other issues before going to NRDC. He has a strong water connection because he lived in Marin County and served on the board of the Marin Water District and was president of the Marin Water District for 3 terms. Since being elected to the legislature, he was appointed chair of the Assembly Committee on, it's not exactly water, it's the Assembly Committee on Water, Parks, and Wildlife. And he's been a leading figure in the events of the last 10 weeks or so on water. At the beginning of August, 5 water bills were introduced by legislators, and Jared was the author of maybe 2 of those bills and heavily involved in the other 2. The bills weren't passed by the end of the legislative session at the very beginning of September. The 5 bills are now maybe 3 bills as of yesterday morning. You may have read in the newspapers of the governor's negotiations with the leadership of the Assembly and the Senate. to work out a water package. And that's what Jared is going to talk about. Let me just paint the context for you. This March, one of the other new legislators actually elected was in 2008 was Fran Pavley, who was termed out of the Assembly, and when in the Assembly is famous for introducing AB 1493, the law in 2002, requiring the state to set greenhouse gas emission standards for automobiles, which was truly a landmark. And then she introduced AB 32, the law that passed in 2006, committing the state to roll greenhouse gas emissions from all sources in California back to their level in 1990 by 2020. But Fran was then termed out, but got elected to the Senate and became chair of the Senate Committee on Water. So we have two very, very strong environmentalists. Fran Pavley, really the heroine of climate legislation in California, and I think at a national level, and Jared, leading the effort for NRDC, which is, in terms of California water, has been the tip of the spear for fighting on water rights.
Well, there are other organizations.
That's right. So both of them in positions of leadership in the legislature. And in March, the Senate held hearings on water rights, Fran Pavley's committee. Those were the first hearings on water rights in California in 20 years. And the fact is the legislature has stayed away from touching water issues for 2 or 3 decades or more. It stayed away because these are controversial, because if you do something, you'll offend groups of people. There's no win-win solution. There are better solutions and worse solutions, but not everybody's going to be happy. And the legislators and governors basically have been too timid to touch water really for 3 decades or more. And so it's suddenly a big deal that the legislative leadership of the state indicated its activism this spring and summer to tackle water. And Jared will, when he shows up, which I think any minute now, will tell us what's going on. But Peter, why don't you talk about the San Joaquin?
Since we're talking about the San Joaquin, there's some very historic things that have gone on. As Michael said, the settlement was reached in 2006, but it took 2.5 years till March of 2009 to put the settlement into legislation, which was passed this past March as part of the Omnibus Lands Bill. So work on implementation of the settlement did occur, but it was somewhat hampered, obviously, by the lack of legislation and authorization and funding. We have achieved a major milestone in the San Joaquin with the release of what's called the Interim Flows starting October 1st, so just a little over a week ago. That was part of the settlement package, includes about 4 years of interim flows to gain more data and more insight as to physical characteristics of the river, to understand how to implement the water management programs, as well as the physical fixes that need to be done. So during this period, the physical fixes will be done, but water will flow. We'll gain insights on losses and gains, temperature, capacities, a lot of very important things. And so those flows started, I say, a little over a week ago, and as Michael said, Jared was very much involved in achieving the settlement, and then he was elected in 2006, shortly after the settlement, and advertised in his campaign as being the only card-carrying professional environmentalist to ever be elected to the legislature, and not that there aren't other environmentalists in the legislature, but none who had worked for an organization like NRDC. So Jared used that successfully in his campaign in Marin. Obviously, that wouldn't probably go over too well if he was in Fresno. But as I said, on the San Joaquin, we are seeing flows that have been released and are literally crawling down the formerly dry, sanded bed reach below what's called Gravelly Ford, which is where the water actually historically it flowed to. Small amounts were released from Bryant Dam to satisfy downstream water rights, a small amount. Most of the water from Bryant Dam went into the canals, Bryant Kern Canal, Madera Canal, to serve the irrigation districts of the southern San Joaquin Valley. So now we have this historic milestone, and 5 minutes is what we hear.
Yeah.
So
At the phone call, in the car, in Berkeley, en route.
oh, so who knows? Now it depends on traffic in Berkeley. Like any, what I think the relevance of, the reason why I want to just touch upon the challenges of the San Joaquin is because, as Jared will be talking about, this comprehensive legislation that will address delta issues, will address more than just delta issues. I hopefully will hear about some of the water rights issues that it's trying to address. We may, whatever legislation comes out will be a compromise, but implementation, of course, will be a long, hard road. And the San Joaquin is a good example of that, even with this good settlement, very concrete schedule. I mean, concrete in the sense of do this by this date, do this by this date. It's tough. There's always people who are trying to stop it. There are landowners along the San Joaquin River that are very concerned about the impacts of flows where there haven't been flows before.
Yeah. Can I just add, so for 60 years, the river channel has been dry. So, well, but parts of it have been dry. Right. So the shape of the channel has changed. It's physically not the same channel as it was in 1949. And so it's one of the largest restoration projects in the country. But
the largest. Everyone says one of the largest, and I want to actually, I've been researching this, and I will make the point that it is the largest. And unless there's someone here who wants to say, well, I know of a restoration project. The Kissimmee River is not as long. The Lower Owens, which I'm involved in, is not as long. Taking dams out in the Klamath doesn't count because it's just taking dams out. Well, it doesn't. We'll have another lecture about restoration projects throughout the United States. Now, this is a major undertaking.
As scientists say, going from dry to wet is a phase change. Going from wet to wetter when you remove a dam is not a phase change.
Good point, and it takes an economist to point that out. The San Joaquin, even in the wet reach, we have to restore gravel pits. We have to isolate gravel pits from the river, provide some, perhaps enhance some spawning gravels, obviously put water in the dry reaches. A big deal in the San Joaquin is restoring capacity, both to provide the restoration flows and to improve the flood management system. So, in fact, much of the money for implementing the San Joaquin restoration will be for increasing channel capacity, which will have multiple benefits. The point is that implementing any, whether it's legislation, a settlement, is going to be very, very challenging. So, we can work hard through the legislative process. We can work hard through settlement negotiations. And as I always point out to people who are involved, who always want to achieve consensus on water, as far as achieving benefits for the environment in California, in the aquatic environment, it always, unfortunately, started with litigation. And there's our litigator there. So whether it's Mono Lake, whether it's San Joaquin River, whether it's the Delta, it starts with litigation and often ends with good legislation or settlements and things like that. But now our star is here. And so we have Jared, we've given you the introduction, his great past as a volleyball player, so they all know about how, and all that. So I think since people are really anxiously awaiting for the main topic.
Let me just tell you, Jared is going to talk using words rather than a PowerPoint. So that's a quaint old-fashioned technology, which litigators and legislators have found is very effective. So without further ado, let's welcome Jared.
And I'm already
Jared
live.
Huffman.
Good to see you, Dr. Hanneman.
Good to see you.
I'll just put this right here. Well, hi, everyone. It's a mess out there. The Richmond Bridge, both lanes closed, and I had to kind of redirect and go through the city, so I may not be the only person late for this colloquium, but it's great to be here. An honor to speak with you. I'm really looking forward to your questions, too, after I give some opening remarks. But I thought we'd start out with a little bit of a report on what's going on in the state legislature this year on this Delta crisis, what is the current state of play, why we're doing it, what we're doing, and some of my own thoughts about where I hope it will go. And then I'll be happy to open it up to any questions you have. But I assume I don't need to spend too much time talking to you about the importance of the Delta and the significance of this estuary, since you just heard from Peter Vorster and Dr. Hanneman and others have probably told you. The top line stuff, this is the most important estuary arguably on the west coast of either the Americas, critical also for our economy and our water supply in the state of California. And lots of other infrastructure that people don't often associate with the Delta, natural gas pipelines and roads and other very, very significant pieces of our built environment that traverse the Delta. I guess there's one more thing, though, that I would urge you to think about when you think of the Delta, and that is that the Delta, as we know today, is not a very natural place. It has sort of evolved over the last 140 years or more, 150 years. And it kind of started back with the Swamp Lands Act of, I believe it was 1861. And what we did was take this seasonal wetland that would have normally been the waters of the United States, property of the United States, and we passed a law that said if you were willing to build up your own levees and maintain them, you could reclaim that land and it would be your property, conditioned on your continuing to maintain those levees going forward. And so that is how land ownership and actual state jurisdiction over the land areas of the Delta began. And what unfolded over the next many decades is that people did indeed reclaim the land. They built up lots of levees simply by piling up dirt in most of those cases. And they created what you now recognize as this series of sloughs and islands, 1,100 miles of levees actually in the Delta. And as the farming commenced in those years, they found that because of the properties of the soil, which is peat deposited there over the millennia, as they farmed it, much of that soil just oxidized into the air. It disappeared. And the land subsided. And that's why when you go in the Delta, you have that almost surreal experience in many cases of being on land in a irrigated farm and looking up at the masts of ships going by in the water above you. It's very odd. Some of these islands are being farmed now 20, 30 feet below sea level. But that is the Delta as we know it today. It's not a very natural landscape. But nevertheless, for many, many decades, it was able to sustain an amazing ecosystem. And the collapse of the ecosystem as we know it really has been a fairly recent phenomenon. I think you could probably plot out a decline over many, many years, but certainly the second consecutive closure of the salmon fishery this year, something like that has never happened before. All of these food chain species that are teetering on the brink of extinction, and the other problems throughout the ecosystem have kind of snuck up on us in the last decade. And that is kind of why we're stepping up and trying to address the Delta crisis right now in the legislature, because as important as this estuary is, it's really in a crisis. Things are not going very well. We have species conflict that sort of start with the much celebrated Delta smelt that you've been hearing about, but actually salmon are right behind them. There's already one species of salmon that's led to court interventions in the Delta pumps, and the rest of the salmon runs are not looking good. There are other food chain species. I think it's the threadfin shad and another species of shad that is right behind the Delta smelt in terms of its teetering on the brink of extinction. And the scientists agree that there's three basic causes to this collapse. One is excessive Delta pumping. Until the court interventions of a few years ago, record amounts of water were being pumped and exported from the delta. The other is invasive species. We have, for some reason, decided we need to have ports in places like Stockton and Sacramento. And you know, one of the consequences of maintaining those chip channels and that maritime activity is you get ballast water from all over the world coming right up into the delta. And so we have invasive clams and other problems as a result of that, and they're really quite destructive of the ecosystem. And then the third is pollution and runoff, primarily ag runoff, but also municipal discharges. The entire Central Valley, in case you didn't know it, is operating, has been for years, under a complete waiver of the Clean Water Act. We don't require the same waste discharge requirements or permits that we do of other dischargers when it comes to agriculture throughout this huge watershed. They've just got a waiver. And it's obviously a big problem. So those are the causes that the scientists have identified. I would argue that there's a fourth culprit in this crisis, though, and that is the lack of accountable, transparent, and effective water governance. Government agencies in the Delta, and there are actually more than 200 of them involved one way or another, have failed to resolve the crisis, in part because nobody is really in charge. And rather than avoiding or leading us out of the crisis, some of them have actually taken actions that make matters worse. They've fought over the Delta in interagency bureaucratic battles in court and in the legislature. As recently as about 6 weeks ago, the Department of Water Resources, one of the main players for the state of California in the Delta, filed briefs in federal courts seeking to set aside peer-reviewed biological opinions from the federal government for salmon in the Delta smelt. And mind you, that was just after they convinced the California Department of Fish and Game to adopt those very same biological opinions so that they could have permits under the State Endangered Species Act. For years, the State Water Project has been operating without any permit under the California Endangered Species Act. And when asked about that, they sort of wave their hands and say, well, there's sort of implied permission over here. But the truth is, they haven't had a permit. And they needed the Department of Fish and Game to adopt something so that they could continue to operate without being vulnerable to legal challenge. So they got them to adopt this new these new peer-reviewed opinions from the federal government, and then turned right around and sought to overturn those opinions. So that's the kind of schizophrenia and dysfunction, frankly, that we have from the agencies that currently govern the Delta. And under this system, the governor directly or through his direct appointments to the heads of the Department of Water Resources and Fish and Game, who serve at his pleasure, has an awful lot of influence over key decisions in the Delta. Our current governor, in my opinion, hasn't shown a lot of interest in the health and the long-term sustainability of the Delta and its fisheries. He prefers to go on Fox News and rant about the Endangered Species Act. And as recently as a couple of weeks ago, he sent a letter to the Obama administration repeating his frequent, and I would argue false, claim that the hardships being suffered by communities in the Central Valley right now, and they're very real hardships, are all to blame on a 2-inch minnow because the Endangered Species Act elevates that minnow above the farm economy and humans in the Central Valley. And so anyway, exercising this tremendous power that he has under the current dysfunctional governance system, Governor Schwarzenegger has been pursuing a pretty specific plan to fix the Delta. It is called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, or Bdcp. And if you talk about these Delta issues, you're going to sooner or later need to talk about and understand Bdcp. What this is all about is, since the projects have no long-term permits under the Endangered Species Act, they are attempting to come together and do an HCP to get a 50-year permit under the Federal Endangered Species Act, possibly an NCCP to get similar coverage under the CISA, the California Endangered Species Act. And the centerpiece to their plan to assure the fisheries agencies that their operations are going to be okay and they won't need to continue getting periodic take permits is a 15,000 Cfs Peripheral Canal. And to give you a sense, if you're not a hydrologist, 15,000 Cfs is a lot of water. It's big. It's about as big as they propose it as the Sacramento River itself right at downtown Sacramento. And the governor has stated that his goal is to break ground on this facility before he leaves office at the end of next year. And he believes that he has all of the legal authority and financing right now, without approval of the legislature, to do that. And that's because, in large part, water contractors have pledged their own funds to actually build the facility. So he doesn't need any financing from the state, or so they believe at this point. On its current path, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan might look at different infrastructure alternatives. It might consider different facilities, different alignments, different operational scenarios. Or it might not. It might include robust ecosystem recovery provisions, such as an NCCP under state law, or it might not. It might result in more sustainable levels of delta diversions over time. Or it might not. It might actually seek to increase delta diversions and create a whole new set of impacts. It definitely will not include the kind of safeguards that I think, and many members of the legislature and environmental groups think, are necessary to protect the delta over the long term. And it definitely will not include any governance reforms. It would leave key decisions to the same authorities who have helped, frankly, to wreck the delta in recent years, with the same disproportionate influence by delta water exporters that exist today. So the need to redirect this Bdcp process, as well as to provide major reforms for delta governance and, of course, to address the ecosystem collapse and the many ramifications of that, are among the primary reasons why I think the legislature does need to act this year, and why I've worked very hard to try to finalize a package of water policy and governance reform bills that culminated in early September, with a package that we moved to the penultimate stage of the legislative process, but we didn't actually bring up for a vote because we frankly just ran out of time. The key elements of that legislation derive mostly from one of the things that this governor has done right. And I'm pretty critical of this governor on water issues, but I think one of the good things that he did was he created the Delta Vision Task Force about 3 years ago. And that led, over the course of 2 years of very hard work, co-chaired by Dr. Rick Frank of UC Berkeley, to a strategic plan that included some very comprehensive and, in some cases, provocative recommendations. And it set the stage for legislative action, hearings, working groups that we have had this year to implement the recommendations of that task force. So some of the basic elements, the key ingredients to those recommendations and to the legislation that has emerged this year. First, the legislation reflects the so-called co-equal goals as a management objective for the Delta. But it differs a little bit from Delta Vision on that point. Delta Vision recommended that the co-equal goals, and these are statewide water supply reliability and Delta ecosystem restoration. Delta Vision recommended that these co-equal goals be actually enshrined in the state constitution and become a new legal paradigm, and we disagreed with that. There were many folks that looked at that and felt that elevating this new and untested, frankly, concept of co-equal goals, we didn't really know how that would affect the public trust doctrine. We didn't know how that would affect existing regulatory authorities and lots of other things. So the legislation does embrace the co-equal goals concept, but it reflects them as management objectives and not as a new legal paradigm. It includes a bold new recovery plan for the Delta ecosystem, and I want to emphasize recovery because for the past several decades, the Delta ecosystem has been managed on a permit-by-permit, species-by-species, crisis-by-crisis basis. There's really been no long-term solution to get us out of this spiral. And so the idea here is we'll finally put a plan in place that's not about avoiding extinction on a species-by-species basis, but rather looking at the whole ecosystem, both aquatic and terrestrial, and trying to recover it to some kind of a healthy state. It includes a plan for statewide water supply reliability that reflects a policy of increased regional self-sufficiency and also reduced dependence on the Delta. It includes new water governance to increase accountability, transparency, and very importantly, the role of independent science in key ecosystem and water supply decisions affecting the Delta. It includes a new Delta Conservancy to acquire and manage lots of new habitat to support ecosystem restoration. Most of the estimates are between 50 and 100,000 acres of new interconnected habitat in the Delta that will need to be acquired and managed for the ecosystem. It includes the first serious water conservation mandate for the state of California to try to realize the governor's stated goal of reducing water use 20% per capita by the year 2020. And for the first time actually asks the ag sector to participate in water use efficiency. Quite honestly, it's a pretty soft ask. It asks them to develop water conservation plans and to use best practices. But hey, that's a start, and it's a heck of a lot more than we've ever done, and in politics, this is the art of the possible. It includes other reforms to address some of the more glaring policy gaps in California and bring our state's water management into the 20th century, if not the 21st century. So, for example, it would require reporting of both surface and groundwater diversions. It would give the State Water Board enhanced penalties and enforcement tools to crack down on illegal water diversions throughout the state. It doesn't go all the way towards groundwater regulation, which frankly we should do, but it takes an important step in that direction by requiring measurement and having some actual consequences to not measuring. Now, one key recommendation that was not in the package is fees and fee authority. And I think that the postmortems on the demise of the CalFed process almost always include the fact that they ran out of money and they were wildly optimistic at the beginning and assuming that there would just continue to be support from the state and federal government without providing some sort of authority that could assess fees and collect them and use them to finance ongoing activities. That was a central recommendation of the Delta Vision process. Sadly, it has not yet appeared in this legislation. It was assumed that that was going to be dealt with on a separate general obligation bond that was being negotiated, but our Republican colleagues objected to any fees being included in that. And so right now, we have many of the Delta Vision recommendations in the policy and governance bills, but we do not include one of the most important, and I think we need to address that, frankly. We need to give them fee authority and provide some money to actually operate. In most other ways, though, the package does reflect the recommendations of Delta Vision. And the basic goal here is to take us out of this current circular firing squad of conflicting policies, piecemeal plans, lawsuits, lobbying agendas, PR campaigns, and to create a unified, comprehensive plan for managing the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta and its resources. The legislation, I think, sets the Bdcp process on a credible path to success. One that needs to be based on robust ecosystem goals, good science, and careful analysis of all options, not a pre-decided specific project. And also needs to include measurable objectives and long-term adaptive management. On the lightning rod issue of conveyance, I want to be very specific about what the legislation does and does not do. It does not endorse a peripheral canal or choose from among the myriad possibilities for improving Delta conveyance, whether that be fixes to the through Delta conveyance system, new points of diversion, or new modes of conveyance. But it does recognize that the current conveyance system is not sustainable and that change, whether due to crashing fisheries, rising sea levels, or some type of catastrophic event, is inevitable. No one can credibly argue to you that 50 to 100 years from now we will manage Delta water supplies the same way as we do today. It's just not going to work. However, I think it's important to have the horse in front of the cart. So alternatives have to be seriously explored, and they have to be put through rigorous review. We need to include independent science and not just agency scientists and house scientists from the water contractors. We need to have policies in place and processes that are transparent, and issues like ecosystem assurances and the water needs and in-stream flow requirements for the Sacramento River and the Delta need to be resolved up front before key decisions are made about Delta conveyance. And that, I believe, is what this legislative package seeks to do. So as we start this discussion, let's remember what's at stake and what this debate in the Delta is really about. Probably the most important decision that needs to be made is whether to continue with the status quo and just hope things will get better for the Delta, for the species that depend on it, for the businesses and millions of Californians who depend on it. Or whether we launch a new governance system and planning framework for the Delta to reset our goals for recovery of the ecosystem and the reestablishment of a healthy estuary instead of this chaos of trying to avoid extinction species by species. The question really is whether to change the way key policy and infrastructure decisions are made and the criteria by which they're made. And I think it's very important to remember that the status quo is going to continue if we take no action. So let's be very clear about what that status quo means. Right now, the Department of Water Resources and state and federal water contractors are pursuing a permit process through the Bdcp that could result in the development of a peripheral canal for the Delta. The administration argues it doesn't need approval from the legislature or the voters to implement that project. Now, not everyone agrees with them, but I think it's safe to say that that process is going to continue on its current path if we do nothing. Right now, there is no public forum where the environmental groups and other interests can bring their concerns about whether water supply operations are being properly balanced against our ecosystem goals. Right now, there's no entity charged with balancing the environment versus water supplies and other conflicting interests, and there's no way for Delta communities to engage in that kind of a discussion. And right now, the primary environmental protections for the Delta are two biological opinions for Delta smelt and winter run Chinook salmon, and they are under attack in the courts and in Congress. So the question is, do we continue down that course, or do we try a new approach and show some leadership and, yes, probably take a little bit of political heat? But I believe that is the question, and I firmly believe the answer, given those choices, is to try to come up with this new framework and try to pass the legislation this year. But it needs to be good, and I really want to emphasize that caveat because, frankly, the process has not been ideal. It hasn't been as open and transparent and deliberative as I would like, and since session ended in the second week of September, much of the remaining work that needed to be done on this package has kind of gone into the black hole of the Big Five, and that means it's the governor and the two Democratic leaders and the two Republican leaders. You know, do the math. I mean, that's a process that actually magnifies the influence of Republicans well beyond the influence they ought to have, given the number of seats that they hold in the legislature, which is not very many and dwindling. So I don't like that process. It's not good in terms of transparency and deliberation, and I think it puts myself and others who want certain policies at a very awkward situation vis-a-vis some interests who don't want those policies. Replicating this, you know, this is what we do in the budget in California, right? We go to the Big Five, and we have to do that because it's a 2/3 requirement to pass a budget, and because we have this cliff that the state goes off if we don't get there, right? The state shuts down, we run out of money, bad things happen. So we have to do the Big Five every year at budget time, but why we would want to replicate that on a big, important policy issue like water, if we don't have to, is beyond me. And the reason that we have done it is because the governor, a couple of weeks ago, issued an ultimatum that he was prepared to veto over 700 bills on his desk if we didn't very quickly not only do a water deal, but do it on his terms. And so it sort of forced us into this Big Five process. Thankfully, we did not rush to any capitulation, and the governor backed down. And he pretty much signed bills and vetoed them as he would in any normal year. But it has sort of led to a lot of activity in the Big Five, and I think in the days ahead it's going to be very interesting if we can pull that now back into the policy committees, open it up a little bit, and engage with folks outside of the Big Five. My hope, now that we've declared a special session for water, is that we will do just that. We'll have hearings, we'll have actual drafts of this that get to be reviewed and circulated so we can have feedback on it, and that the other very important piece of this is that just because we're simultaneously negotiating a bond that does require a 2/3 vote doesn't mean we need to treat these policy and government and governance issues as if they too require 2/3, because they don't. These are majority vote items, and it's important that they be treated as such. So with that, I just want to say that I continue to feel a great sense of urgency, both a political and a moral imperative to try to get this done, but also an equally strong imperative to get it done right, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I think could I ask you to use the mic when asking your question? I know it takes a little bit longer, but it's better for the tape. Okay.
Thanks for those comments. I'm an economist, and I have a problem with this idea of a co-equal goal. So I'm wondering what happens when a conflict erupts, and these are diametrically opposed goals. It's not like wine and cheese. So I'm curious about how this conflict resolution process would work. Essentially, do the fish get thrown under the bus, or do the farmers? Can you please elaborate on that mechanism?
Well, I'm not an economist. I'm a politician, so I focus more on the goals part of the co-equal. And since they are simply goals, they're not necessarily diametrically opposed. You can have wine and cheese, I think. It's an attempt to manage for both. But I think you raise a good point. At some point, they will be in conflict. And I think people on both sides of this equation are very nervous.
They say it's in conflict right now.
Well, depending on your perspective, it's in conflict for the other side. The environmentalists feel that it's been managed for water supply primarily. The water interests are, raising bloody hell about a 2-inch minnow, saying it's been managed for fish, even though the fisheries are collapsing, so it hasn't been managed too well for the fish. But I think the bottom line is that's why we decided not to give that concept of co-equal goals actual legal effect. And so that's why we kind of backed it down to a management objective. But it operates in the current legal and regulatory context. It operates subject to the public trust doctrine, subject to the Endangered Species Act, subject to all of the other protections that I would argue establish that the water supply exports from the Delta are actually subordinate to a healthy environment. That is my view of the current law, and that's how it ought to work. Yeah. So I don't think this has legally changed that. Of course, if a water supply person wants to argue that it's actually the other way around, they're free to continue doing that as well. Mm-hmm.
What are the chief arguments against the biological opinions? You mentioned they're under attack right now.
Yeah, what's happened, we're in the third year of a drought, and it's had an effect on water supplies around the state. It's particularly had an effect in the Central Valley for the most junior of the water contractors, which is the Westlands Water District on the west side of the valley. So they started out the year with a projected 0% water allocation from the federal project. That was bumped up to, I think, Peter, what did they end up with, like 15% or something?
But they got a hell of a lot more water than that 15%.
Right, they did transfers, they got groundwater, but at the time of those early projections, some of their farmers made decisions to fallow crops. And that did have an impact on folks. It impacted jobs. And it came, the important part is it came right in the middle of a terrible economic collapse where the construction industry in that part of the state has completely gone down the tubes. And so that's why you're seeing, primarily why you're seeing these 40 and 50% unemployment numbers in those parts of the San Joaquin Valley. It's not the farm economy. The farm economy is actually, I mean, Professor Hanneman could speak to this better than me, but isn't it fairly consistent with where it's been in recent years?
Yes.
But nevertheless, the fact that you have a federal court that has said you can't pump as much as you'd like from the Delta has led to this political frenzy. Fox News has jumped all over it. Sean Hannity has actually televised from a fallowed tomato field in the Westlands Water District, calling this Obama's Katrina. And it was a little ironic because this is the largest tomato crop the state of California has ever produced, and he was in a fallowed tomato field. But, I don't mean to be flip or dismissive at all about the human suffering that's going on in the San Joaquin Valley. It's real, but it's not because of the Endangered Species Act or the Delta smelt. It's because of a drought and a broader economic collapse that's really hitting that region particularly hard.
I'd like to hear you drill down a little bit on fees. There's a lot of very high-value crops grown in California, but then there's alfalfa, seed alfalfa, and cotton, which are some of the leaders. New water supply is $700 to $1,000 an acre foot, and they're selling water for those crops at $4 to 30 an acre foot. You can't grow it. So the fee structure, or some fix to the fee structure, could begin to reallocate water away from low value-added crops to human uses, ecological uses, and high-value crops. Why is it such a sacred cow to not touch fees?
You said cow, which is an interesting choice, because the one crop of alfalfa actually consumes more water in the state than all of the urban consumption throughout the state combined. So it's kind of the poster child for the point that you're making. Do we need to be growing this much alfalfa in the state of California? You can absolutely make the case conceptually, academically, that all needs to fundamentally change. Actually, moving forward policies that make it happen, though, are really tough. I mean, that gets into telling farmers what they can grow, where they can grow it, how they grow it. And right now, I'm just struggling to pass a bill that says that they need to use some best practices and do a report on their efficiency, and you would think I'm asking for a pint of blood. So there is the realm of the politically doable, and then there's the very interesting points that you make that someday I hope we will be able to address.
Hi, Jared. Back here. For a governor who proclaims to be such an advocate for climate change action, I'm just wondering, with respect to the Peripheral Canal and the long-term projections for Sierra snowpack and runoff from the northern Sierras, what the kind of long-term desirability is of that particular component of water conveyance infrastructure, and if the Bay Delta system itself is impacted by climate change through sea level rise, how the advocates for Peripheral Canal are actually, making the long-term case that over the next 50 plus years, this is going to continue to provide reliability to the state water project rather than alternative methodologies like groundwater recharge and conservation and water recycling, et cetera.
Well, I think from the urban perspective, it's driven in large part by water quality, which is kind of bad and getting worse in the South Delta. And they look at the fact that sea level's rising, the water quality is not improving, it's getting more saline, and if you assume a few key levee breaks, which the geologists and seismologists tell us are pretty much inevitable at this point, the whole system could be out of commission. And once that happens, once those levees break and the islands are flooded, and the flooding, remember, comes in from the saltwater side, not the freshwater side, it's going to take a long time to flush all that salt water out of the system to where they can resume pumping from the South Delta. So they're looking at a very vulnerable situation where their delta supplies could be lost for a year or more in that kind of an event. And they see a peripheral canal as a way to take high quality water, and yes, a seismic event might cause damage to the canal, but that could be repaired and they could continue drawing the high quality water. Currently, that system goes out, they're in deep, deep trouble for a long time. So that's what's driving them. And the other piece of it is the species conflict, because the massive pumping regime from the South Delta has completely changed the flow of this estuary to the point where rivers flow backward. Most of the channels that should be flowing out into the Delta are flowing backward and south towards those South Delta pumps. And the more we hear from experts like Peter Moyle and others, they tell us that's not going to work for the long-term recovery of species like the Delta smelt. It creates this impossible migration pathway, too, for juvenile salmon trying to get out of the system. So I think there is a case to be made that the current system may be incompatible with some of our fishery recovery goals. And that's one of the things that's going to have to be looked at in an independent and robust way. But that I think, is the main factors that are driving the need for a change in conveyance.
Hi there. I just want to say, first off, thanks very much for all your efforts.
Thank you.
It's great to see someone finally actually taking this by the horns and doing something about it, so that's great. My question actually centers around the role of ag in the state water use sort of budget. And given that ag is about 85% of the state water use, I'm always sort of surprised that there aren't more programs to help improve the efficiency, sort of like a voluntary program or something like that would help improve the efficiency of some of the farmers. Like I was actually just down near Fresno the other day, and there were alfalfa fields that they're still using flood irrigation. Right. Here we are trying to get 10 CFS down the San Joaquin, and they're flooding their fields. I'm just wondering if there's maybe a sort of a voluntary program or some other programs that would be more amenable to farmers, I guess.
Well, that's kind of the step we're trying to take with the conservation bill that's in this package. But if you talk to folks who are flood irrigating alfalfa in the Central Valley, they're going to tell you that it's a highly efficient way to irrigate, because they're going to say that whatever the plant doesn't transpire goes straight into the groundwater table and recharges that aquifer, so that the next time their deliveries are cut from surface water sources, they tap into the aquifer, and they sort of see it as this perfectly efficient conjunctive use system. And there's another side of that story, of course, and there are mostly the people that say that are getting very cheap water. So this is where the economics come into play, because if you go across the valley to Westlands, and we criticize Westlands a lot, but the fact is they're some of the most efficient farmers in California, because they have had a highly variable supply and a relatively expensive supply by virtue of their contract. And so they've actually got some great stories to tell on ag water use efficiency. But the differences are remarkable, just from one irrigation district to another, depending on how they get their water, how cheap it is, et cetera. The other big issue here when we talk about trying to save water with ag is this extreme philosophy, I think, against anyone telling them what to do. You know, these are very stoic, independent folks. And part of that is they're very afraid that if someone forces them to use less water, they will then take away the water they're not using. So it's sort of the water rights system comes into play. And you know, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Israel, but I did a trip to Israel a couple years ago, and everyone thinks of Israel as you know, this paragon of water use efficiency. And yeah, it's true in the Negev desert, that's correct. But if you go up to the Galilee, they're flood irrigating cotton. And if you ask about why they're doing that, it's because they don't want to lose their water rights and their allocations from the Jordan River to someplace else. So it's the same kind of story playing out, you know, in lots of different places.
Well, Jared, you knew I was going to get a question from me, and so I'll try and not make this too compound and avoid the issue of the fact that the Bay Area is more dependent on Delta water than anybody else, anywhere else in the state, but I'll let Tim and you talk about that. Go into more detail about this financing package, the revenue versus the general obligation bond, the risk that we take if it's a GO bond, you know, our great Republican desire to, you know, saddle the budget with more debt. And could you conceive of a scenario where your package and what you're espousing for gets through on that majority vote, but you would find yourself having to vote against the financing for it because of this general obligation problem, the bond problems?
Yeah. Yeah, there's the bond is a very disruptive element in, you know, what otherwise I think is a very doable package of policy and governance reforms, and it's problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't need to tell you that, you know, if you're students, you're paying higher fees. If you're faculty, you're worried about your budget. I mean, the state of California is out of money. We've had the worst fiscal collapse in the last couple of years since the Great Depression. Every part of state government is taken more than a haircut. It's taken a scalping. And our credit rating has gone right down with it. We have the worst credit rating in the United States of America right now. We're like a third world nation in terms of our access right now to Wall Street lenders. So the idea that may have looked pretty good a year and a half ago or whenever we were last talking about a major general obligation bond suddenly is a very tough sell. Because of the burden on the general fund, and no one can tell you how we're going to pay the debt service. A $10 billion water bond is about $800 or $900 million a year in new debt service on the general fund. That's a significant amount. And in terms of, you know, whether we could even sell these bonds or whether the voters would approve them. Because keep in mind, it takes a 2/3 vote of the legislature to actually get them to the voters. Then the voters have to say yes. So the politics of this bond are very gnarly. To get the 2/3, you have to appease the minority Republicans. To do that, you got to have a lot of money for dams. They don't like a lot of this stuff that they call environmental pork, right? But the environmental pork is what voters like, and so you got to pass both steps to be successful in a bond. The whole reason that the bond continues to be part of this is because the governor has said that he will not sign anything unless it is accompanied by a big general obligation bond that specifically includes money for new surface storage. So that's kind of where we are. Would he back down from that if it appeared that the votes weren't there, that it just wasn't viable to pass a bond? I'm not sure. I hope that he would consider fallback strategies, as he has, you know, with other ultimatums.
So the I think it was the Bureau of Reclamation or the Army Corps of Engineers issued a cost-benefit analysis a few weeks ago, which my student Damien Bickett looked at. And the benefit-cost ratio comes out just above 1 only because of the assumption that water would be sold to farmers for, was it $500? $700? Yeah, temperance. So the question is, what is the governor thinking? That is, he wants water supply. And presumably he sees some fraction of that going to agricultural water users. But does he assume that, in fact, the general taxpayer would pick up their cost? So, A, what is the governor thinking?
Yeah.
And B, even putting the governor aside, how do you see financing water supply, even if there were no, other adverse consequences?
Well, let's start with what the governor's thinking. Yeah, I'm being pretty hard on the governor tonight. I'm in a foul mood. I, got in traffic on the way here, so I'm just going to tell you what I think. I think it's either profound ignorance, because he continues to say that we need a comprehensive solution to California's water problems, and that means we need this Temperance Flat Dam on the San Joaquin River. And because we have a population now of 38 million, and we have a water supply system that was built for 18 million. I mean, he continues to say this stuff, and therefore we need this dam. And it's just, it doesn't pass even the most simple analysis. I mean, this dam will produce a water supply yield of only about 100,000 acre feet. That's it. I mean, I could build you 2 desal plants, and you're done. You've produced the water, and I could build them closer to the demand centers of the population increase, if that's what we're trying to solve here in California, and do it for a fraction of the $4 or so billion that it may cost to build this project. And so what you see is all of these shifting rationale for this project. It's the ultimate sort of project in search of a rationale. I've heard people say, well, it'll be used, for groundwater recharge. We'll be able to capture these high flows and then send it out to farmers, recharge the groundwater, and that'll be great. The problem is, right now in high flow events, they already try to do that. They have this, what they call Article 215 water, and they can't get farmers to pay more than $10 or $15 an acre foot for it. Tops for recharge water. Recharge water, just isn't worth a lot to folks in that part of the world. So the idea that people are going to pay $500 an acre feet for recharge water is specious. So, if you can't come up with an honest reason on why this should be an important, broadly beneficial part of a water supply package, you have to conclude that it's pretty cynical in its politics. And I think that's exactly what it is. I think there are folks who, as an article of faith, as political ideology, have for many years just said, if you're not building dams, you're not solving our water problems. And I think that's what this is. It's not rational. Yeah.
So I have one comment, one question. The comment, I want to echo another one that was made, which is just to say thanks, because probably you don't get a lot of that in your line of work, and it's not often you hear people who are in your position who have the background and understanding of the issues, let alone trying to solve them. So thank you.
Thank you.
The question's about independent science. You mentioned the legislation that you guys are working on. 2 weeks ago, we had the State Estuary Conference here in Oakland, and we had a chance to talk to the current lead scientist and some of the former lead scientists of the Bay Delta program, and there were rumblings about a National Academy review at the time, and they agreed unanimously that it'd be not a great idea for the Academy to step into that issue, and that anybody who had been through a review would know better than to ask for it. And then sure enough, the next day, it was pretty much done on the federal side. So what's the current status of the state and federal discussion about the role of an independent science program, not, as you said, the agency science folks who do good work and that work needs to be done, but the outside perspective?
Well, the need for an independent science program was one of the key recommendations of Delta Vision. It is responsive to the fact that we're at a point now where we've so starved all the agencies that depend on the general fund, like the Department of Fish and Game, that they no longer have the resources, they no longer have the expertise. They're not getting the best and the brightest. If you go across the building or downstairs, I guess as it were, to upstairs to the Department of Water Resources, where they have fee revenues from the water contractors generated from water sales, they do have a lot of money, and they've got a lot of scientists, and they now have a lot more scientists than the Department of Fish and Game. So they're not independent scientists, but they're scientists. Delta Vision concluded, I think correctly, that we need a new independent science program where we will call upon academics and others who aren't working for a specific interest to do peer review, to guide us on adaptive management, and so far that hasn't been a particularly controversial part of the package. But as the biological opinions go, and the fact that, we now have the National Academy of Science that's going to do the yet another round of peer review, at least I'm heartened that the questions put to the Academy, the key is always what questions are asked. The questions are pretty narrow, and as I read them at least, it appears to say, are there strategies that should have been considered that might get you to the same biological objectives in a way that doesn't affect water supply so much. So we'll see what the Academy does. Yeah.
Should I go? First, I wanted to thank you for coming to UC Berkeley. Sorry, it was not a pleasant traffic experience. So I have to ask you this since we're here at this great research university. I'd heard about conversations regarding the bond, and now after hearing what you just said, it might be moot. But if a bond is negotiated, do you think in the details they will work out a percentage to be designated, a small percentage for R&D, given how difficult the implementation of everything will be?
I'm not aware of any research and development money in the bond.
Any hope for any future?
For the archives out here. I would say unless you can prevail upon Republicans that this is a priority, I doubt it, because that's just the political reality. I don't mean to be partisan in saying that, but it's just the reality. The bond is a 2/3 proposition. The Republicans are going to call the shots on what's in it at the end of the day. And right now, they sort of see anything that's not, concrete and facilities as being, pork. That's their view of it. So I'd say it's a tough sell just to keep some of the ecosystem pieces in the bond, which we know would minimally be required to pass this at the polls next year. That's my reaction.
I'll say thanks as well for coming and talking to us about these important issues. Every watershed that's over-appropriated eventually comes down to what's the maximum level we can appropriate, and how do we release the water that we're going to give to the stream, and hopefully in a mimicking a natural hydrograph. And I'm wondering if those kinds of concepts are ever going to make it into policy where we get past this question of, ag saying, we're not the greatest water user in the system. Nature's the greatest water, and where we can just say, no, this is what we need to keep the delta alive and move beyond.
That's a great question, and that was one of the most important things for me as I worked on trying to develop this package, and I think is one of the best things about this legislative package, because it requires that before the Bdcp process gets to finalize its infrastructure decision and take that to the various agencies for permits, the State Water Board has to weigh in and do a public trust analysis of what the Delta needs for the first time, at least the first time in the way that we've conceived it, that's comprehensive, that's not just about water quality objectives or some narrow piece, but that's actually about what does a healthy estuary need. And then we'll figure out how much water is available for export. And it also requires the Department of Fish and Game to develop some biological objectives that will inform that State Board analysis. So, it's probably not perfect, but I think the fact that we've tried to get that in on the front end, and then we can have an interesting discussion about how much water is left over and what's the best way to convey it. That's a big change from the path that we're currently on, and I think is worth supporting for that reason.
It's great to have an opportunity to ask you these questions directly. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the conservation element of the plan. I think it was you yourself who might have made the statement that if we focused on conservation and efficiency, we could provide most of the water that will be needed in addition to what we currently are using in the state of California. But I notice, especially I just came from an EB Mud meeting over in Oakland where they're talking about their 2040 plan. And we have the tendency to look for big projects to do to deal with our big problems, whereas really simple things like efficiency, conservation, and gray water, rainwater, stormwater, blackwater reuse are all probably the most effective and immediate ways to deal with these problems. So I'm just wondering where these things fit into the conservation part of the plan.
Well, thanks. I think it's one of the most important pieces of this, but you might be disappointed when you see what's actually in this conservation bill. It doesn't direct anything specific. It allows each region and each water district to come up with their own plan for trying to achieve a 20% per capita reduction. So it's not a gross water use. It's not a reduction in water use mandate. It is a per capita efficiency target because it recognizes that lots of places are going to continue to grow. But it's a lot better than anything we have now. And I think, conservation, although it has by far numerically the most potential, I mean, you look at what we can get through efficiency and it dwarfs storage or anything else, pretty much. There are some areas of the state that are better able to conserve than others. And the real challenge with conservation is that everybody says it sounds good, everybody likes it, but they want someone else to do it. East Bay Mud doesn't want anyone telling them how they have to conserve. Drives them nuts, drives everybody nuts. And so the politics of any kind of a mandate or any kind of, even specific best management practice requirements get very, very difficult. You have entire parts of the state that argue against all of this, saying conservation has to be locally cost effective. And that's been the off-ramp so far because we have this California Urban Water Management Council and this Memorandum of Understanding currently that sets out all these wonderful best practices that need to happen, volumetric pricing and all these other things. But there's a big off-ramp that says if it's not locally cost-effective, you don't have to do it. And any place where your water is cheap and abundant, any conservation won't be locally cost-effective. So that's why that is the argument we have with the city of Sacramento and lots of the places around there right now that don't do water metering. They argue it's not cost-effective because their water is very cheap. So it's a challenge. Mm-hmm.
So I have a clarifying question on that last thing and what you just said, and because this actually could be a bombshell, I'm not quite sure. And then the actual question. So when you talk about 20% per capita reduction and putting ag aside, which is this huge, interesting area, does that mean against average per capita use in the state, or is that against per capita use in each location? In the sense that if you're wasting water now, you can still waste except only 80%. That's my clarification.
It's in that location, and it's based on a 10-year base, a 10-year rolling average using certain time periods.
So is everybody turning on their taps right now in anticipation of that?
It's also, yeah, right, run up the baseline. It's also a little more complicated than what I said because it recognizes that in some places, like pick your 10-year baseline. If you want to do 1992 through 2002, right as we came out of the last drought. Well, there were some agencies that saw their water demand really rebound dramatically during that period, because that's what happens when you come out of a drought. Your demand tends to rebound. And there were other agencies that invested a lot in conservation to try to prevent that rebound. And so not everybody starts from the same place, and the bill tries to create some different pathways to allow you to show that, well, gee, during that period I actually did a lot, so we ought to use a slightly different period, or we ought to use a different metric. It's tough to use it as a one-size-fits-all.
So, and then my other question is kind of this crazy question, but I'm sure you'll appreciate it. A lot of people basically consider the Department of Water Resources to be what's called a captive regulator that is owned and operated by the state water project contractors. And of course, they're supposed to serve, I believe, the citizens of the state of California. So is there any notion of spinning off DWR as kind of a branch office of the contractors? And I've heard this from the contractors, let us run the project.
Utility, yeah.
And we will take care of the delta as a contingency of running the project. Is that being taken seriously anywhere? Let alone governance at DWR?
It actually is. And Delta Vision didn't have a specific recommendation on that, but it did say that it needs to be looked at. And so the current package of bills likewise directs that this be explored. It's going to have to be looked at carefully because there's probably one way where you could do that and bring a lot more accountability and good governance to the Department of Water Resources while letting facilities be managed by the folks that use them and benefit directly from them. But it could also be done the wrong way and make it even less accountable. And so I think we want to be very careful, but I think a lot of folks are interested in that possibility, and it's going to get an active look.
I have a question related to the water contractors. I know concern is example of that is the Bdcp and the fact that the water contractors are pretty much running that show, and that to be part of it, you have to sign a waiver saying that you would not sue the agency that implements Bdcp. So that's how the water contractors view open and transparent water policy development. And so looking at SB 68, which is the most recent version of the bill that I've seen, it talks about the accountability and creating these new institutions that will conduct water policy. And it makes a specific requirement for some of them to comply with the Open Meeting Act, the Government Open Meeting Act, the California Public Records Act. But the one institution, the Stewardship Council, that's responsible for preparing the Delta Plan is not subject to both of those requirements. And it does not even have a public hearing requirement for the Delta Plan that it prepares. And so my question is, what is your view on the value of having those kind of mechanisms in the institutions that are created to create this public policy to try to make the decisions an open and transparent process?
Well, I think I probably disagree with you about some of the details and what they do and do not require. I know there was a memorandum of understanding that Bdcp participants had to sign. I was not aware that it included a waiver of litigation rights. That's news to me, so I will need to verify that. But in terms of the Brown Act or open government laws, I think it is very much part of the current framework. It is required. There are monthly meetings required, and a certain number of them each year have to be held in the Delta. There's a specific provision about that. The Delta Plan has to go completely through the CEQA process, and so obviously there are public requirements that are part of that. You know, I can get you some information on that, but I think I would disagree with the premise of the question.
Well, it's based on the September 11th version of SB 68. And when you see these requirements, they are in it for the Delta Conservancy, they are in it for the Delta Protection Commission, but they are not in it for the Delta Stewardship Council. And in fact, the Bdcp, which is controlled by the state water contractors, the Stewardship Council is obligated to include the Bdcp.
If it meets certain standards, you're right. Yeah. Yeah. But I do, you know, I'll need to double check, because where I left off with this package, there was a lot of public transparency required of the Stewardship Council. So you're motivating me to take a second look at it, but I think the premise is incorrect.
So Jared, there's a lot of inside baseball that's getting thrown around here, and perhaps for some of the folks that aren't as tuned in to some of these governance issues, perhaps you can just summarize the highlights of the governance reform. And then I have to ask the question before you leave about some of the concerns that you're hearing from the Bay Area water agencies about the package. And as I said, I have to remind our Bay Area colleagues that we do depend on Delta water more than anybody else in the state. So if you can address that issue.
I don't know about more than anyone else in the state.
2/3 of our water.
Well, maybe on some kind of a proportional analysis.
But I think if you could give the kind of the highlights of the governance reform, it would be helpful.
Well, you know, the highlights of the governance reform are that we're trying to create a comprehensive plan for the Delta. This is one of the most important functions of this new Stewardship Council. That plan would cover all of the elements of Delta policy. So it would include an ecosystem recovery plan. It would include a plan to bring statewide water supply reliability, not just Delta export reliability. This is a very important distinction, but statewide reliability, which could be by investing in projects 800 miles from the Delta. It will include emergency preparedness and a more rational levee investment strategy. And you get into lots of controversial things when you talk about that. Should certain islands be on a do not resuscitate list? Should we be that explicit? I mean, realistically, some of these islands are not going to survive over the long term. But right now, we have this reflexive policy of going in and fixing anything that breaks, even if it costs us more to fix than the value of the land. So we need a more rational system. We need to do a much better job overseeing land use decisions to make sure that they're consistent with all of our broader important goals for the Delta, both for water supply and ecosystem. And I think those are the big issues. So this plan will cover all of that. And then the Stewardship Council will have authority within the Delta to review basically everything that happens with state and local governance to make sure that it's consistent with that plan. And you know, this is controversial in the Delta. They don't like this idea of some statewide council that is thinking about Delta exports as one of their goals, reviewing for consistency everything they do. That's very troubling to them, and that's why they're one of the reasons why they're fiercely opposed to this whole thing. But it's also problematic to people like East Bay Mud, who have facilities going through the Delta and don't want anyone to, you know, that they have to go and seek approval from when they do maintenance or when they have some kind of a capital project. Contra Costa Water District in particular doesn't want to have to get approval from this council. So we're trying to work through some of those issues. The other nuance to this is, what do you do with the federal government? Because the federal government's a huge player in the Delta, and lots of federal agencies, not just the Bureau of Reclamation that, you know, is one of the biggest exporters, but also the Corps of Engineers and Fish and Wildlife Service. There's a lot of federal agencies playing in the Delta. And the best that anyone has been able to come up with so far is that you try to have this plan satisfy the requirements of the Coastal Zone Management Act, the CZMA, which we have used in other cases. That's how we've done the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Act. We've gotten it approved by the Department of Commerce as a CZMA, and what that does is it means that federal agencies will have to act consistent with that plan if it meets these criteria and gets approved. And if they're not acting consistent with the plan, you can appeal that up to the Secretary of Commerce. We've done that with BCDC for San Francisco Bay, and that's worked pretty well, I think, in both cases. It's not a directive authority over federal agencies, but it does give you a way to appeal actions by them that you think are inconsistent with this plan, and have at least some chance, you know, through the mechanism up to the Secretary of Commerce of getting them redirected. The other possibility would be specific federal legislation, and Senator Feinstein has kind of hinted at something like that recently, but it takes a long time to move things through Congress, and there are all kinds of uncertainties about what comes out the other end. So, you know, right now I sort of prefer the CZMA approach.
I want to ask you about the State Board. Mm-hmm. So a few weeks ago, my paper was published, The History of the Delta, which is really an indictment of the State Board and its predecessors' failure to exercise the authorities that they have. And a view of Rick Frank and others is that the State Board has authority, but has been timid and not exercised it. Mm-hmm. So that's the sort of missing piece for water in general. I mean, not specifically the Delta. How do you solve that? You know, giving them powers. And let me emphasize, the reason they haven't exercised this authorities for the last 3 decades is they've been under the thumb of governors who have tossed off members who showed signs of independence. And Governor Schwarzenegger, earlier this year, you know, didn't reappoint the vice chair who showed signs of independence. And so you know, that's part of the picture. And the question is, how do you get the State Board to actually fulfill the functions it has?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. And some of the critics of this package say, well, listen, we've got lots of good laws. We've got a good agency that theoretically could do a lot of this. What we really need is to infuse them with the political will to do it. So great, tell me how to do that. I would if I could. Maybe the next governor will appoint mavericks to sit on the State Board and to you know, take full advantage of the legal tools available to them. But you know, we're trying to give them some new tools in this legislative package, and they've been among the most controversial parts. So for example, in keeping with one of the key recommendations of Delta Vision, geez, we have no handle on what water is being diverted throughout the system. We just don't have a clue. We look the other way. So we wanted to make reporting mandatory for all water users throughout the state, actually, and to put some meaningful penalties in place for those who don't do the reporting, and then also to give the board some tools to actually go out and enforce against illegal water diversions. Right now, if the State Board first learns about your illegal diversion and second decides it wants to do something about it, both of which are wild assumptions, it sets in motion this painfully long process that can take years because they don't have any interim relief ability. They have to do CEQA on most of their major decisions. There are a few CEQA exemptions that they can avail themselves of, but if they do, they're going to be sued. And so they tend to be cautious and practice defensive medicine, as it were. So it's a mess. And I think, you know, giving them the tools to act quickly, giving them the resources, because the other thing about the State Board, you always hear when you raise these issues, well, we just don't have the staff, we don't have the resources. And it's true. They are starved, and I think, you know, maybe by design.
Okay.
There's an argument for why term limits shouldn't be in place, because in 2 years you'll be...
All this will be forgotten.
All be forgotten.
Well, I really want to thank Jared for coming tonight with the huge rainstorm that we had, and finding a bridge closed, and then driving through to the city, jumping on BART and getting here. And I want to really thank you, the audience, for being patient and waiting for him to come. And I think this has been an extraordinary evening. And I don't know, maybe I should just close it there and say thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
And then I do want to make a few standard remarks. If you want to be on our email reminder list and you are not currently on it, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. And we will have another great speaker for you in November. Thank you.